June 19, 1944, Philippine Sea, 250 miles west of Guam. Commander Tamechi Hara stood on the bridge of the destroyer Yahagi, watching formations of Japanese aircraft depart from the carriers of mobile fleet. Over 300 fighters and bombers climbing into the morning sky, heading east toward the American task force. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had committed the entire carrier air wing to a single massive strike, confident that Japanese naval aviators, the finest in the world, would devastate the American fleet just as they had at Pearl Harbor. Hara wrote in his log, "Our pilots are the elite of the Imperial Navy, trained to perfection, flying the superior Zero fighter. The Americans have numbers but lack quality. Today we will demonstrate Japanese air superiority and destroy their invasion fleet." In 4 hours, those words would become a bitter epitaph as American F6F Hellcat fighters tore through Japanese formations with such devastating effectiveness that the engagement would be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a slaughter that destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective force and proved that America's toy planes had become the most lethal fighters in the Pacific. Japanese naval commanders had laughed in 1942 when intelligence reports described American efforts to develop a new carrier fighter to replace the inadequate F-4F Wildcat. The report seemed pathetic. The Americans were building a larger, heavier fighter with more armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and 6 heavy machine guns, all features that would make the aircraft slower and less maneuverable than the Zero. The proposed design violated every principle of fighter combat that Japanese doctrine had perfected: lightweight, maximum maneuverability, long range, minimal armor. American pilots, Japanese commanders believed, were already inferior to their Japanese counterparts. Poorly trained civilians pressed into military service, lacking the Bushido spirit and years of rigorous preparation that made Japanese naval aviators supreme. Giving these inferior pilots heavier, slower aircraft would only make them easier targets for Zero fighters flown by men who dedicated their lives to aerial combat. The Americans didn't understand fighter design, didn't comprehend the tactical principles that governed air combat, didn't possess the industrial sophistication to build aircraft that could challenge Japanese engineering excellence. Their toy planes, heavy, crude, designed by engineers who'd never experienced combat, would be swept from the sky by the Zero, just as American fighters had been swept from the sky at Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and throughout the Philippines campaign. By June 1944, the laughter had died. The Grumman F6F Hellcat had achieved a kill ratio of 19.1 against Japanese aircraft. For every Hellcat lost in combat, 19 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The toy plane had become a killing machine that systematically destroyed Japanese naval aviation, flown by pilots who combined superior training, superior tactics, and superior technology into the most effective fighter force in naval history. The Japanese never understood how comprehensively they'd been outthought, outbuilt, and outfought until their carriers sailed without aircraft and their air bases stood empty of pilots. The doctrine of lightness. Japanese fighter design philosophy in 1942 rested on principles developed through combat experience in China and refined during the early Pacific campaigns. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, formerly designated Type 0 carrier fighter, embodied this philosophy perfectly. An aircraft that sacrificed everything for performance advantages that Japanese doctrine considered decisive. The Zero was extraordinarily light, 5,213 pounds empty weight compared to 7,192 pounds for the American F-4F Wildcat. The weight saving came from eliminating features Western designers considered essential. The Zero had no armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal structural reinforcement. The aircraft was built from the lightest possible materials, using the minimum structure necessary to withstand flight loads. This extreme weight reduction provided remarkable performance. The Zero could outturn any Allied fighter, completing a full 360-degree turn in roughly 16 seconds at combat speeds, compared to 20 seconds for the Wildcat. It could outclimb Allied fighters, reaching 20,000 feet in 7 minutes, 27 seconds versus 12 minutes for early American fighters. It had extraordinary range, 1,160 nautical miles combat radius, allowing operations far from carriers or land bases. Japanese pilots exploited these advantages through tactics that emphasized turning combat, dogfighting, where maneuverability determined outcomes. Zero pilots would engage Allied fighters in turning battles, using superior turn performance to position behind enemy aircraft and shoot them down with accurate, patient gunnery. The tactics had been devastatingly effective in China and remained effective through 1942 in the Pacific. Japanese naval aviation doctrine assumed that fighter combat was fundamentally about individual pilot skill, demonstrated through aerobatic maneuverability. The best pilots flying the most maneuverable aircraft would win, not through technological advantage or tactical innovation, but through superior execution of traditional aerial combat techniques. Pilot training reflected this philosophy. Japanese naval aviators underwent years of rigorous preparation, accumulating hundreds of flight hours before being considered combat-ready. By 1941, Japanese carrier pilots averaged over 800 flight hours, the most extensively trained naval aviators in the world. They'd been selected from thousands of applicants, subjected to brutal training regimens that killed weaker candidates, and indoctrinated with Bushido philosophy that made death preferable to failure. The survivors were elite warriors who viewed themselves as invincible. Commander Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack plan, articulated the prevailing view in a 1941 assessment. "Our pilots are the finest in the world, superior in training, dedication, and combat experience. Our Zero fighter is the most capable aircraft flying today, superior in maneuverability, range, and climb performance. The combination of elite pilots and superior aircraft makes Japanese naval aviation dominant. American pilots are inadequately trained civilians flying inferior aircraft. They cannot match our capabilities and will be defeated in any engagement." The assessment was accurate for 1941 to 1942. It would prove catastrophically wrong by 1943. The American response, American fighter development in early 1942, was driven by desperate recognition that existing aircraft were inadequate. The F-4F Wildcat, the Navy's primary carrier fighter, was comprehensively outperformed by the Zero in almost every metric. The Zero outturned it, outclimbed it, outranged it, and was generally flown by more experienced pilots. American pilots had developed tactics to compensate. The Thatch Weave, a mutual support maneuver where pairs of fighters covered each other, preventing Zeros from getting firing solutions. Boom and zoom attacks, diving from altitude, firing briefly and escaping using superior diving speed and high-altitude performance. Avoiding turning combat, where the Zero's advantages were decisive. These tactics worked marginally. They prevented total American defeat, but didn't provide the capability to dominate Japanese fighters. The Navy needed a fighter that could beat the Zero, not through tactical desperation, but through superior design. Grumman Aircraft received the contract to develop that fighter in June 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before America entered the war, based on combat reports from British and Chinese pilots fighting Zeros. The design requirements reflected hard-learned lessons. The new fighter must survive combat damage that would destroy a Zero, protect its pilot from ground fire and enemy bullets, provide firepower that could destroy enemy aircraft with short bursts, and match or exceed zero performance in practical combat scenarios, even if pure aerobatic performance was inferior. Roy Grumman and his engineering team made design choices that violated Japanese fighter philosophy but reflected American industrial strengths and tactical realities. They built the aircraft larger and heavier, empty weight 9,238 pounds, nearly twice the Zero's weight. They installed armor plate behind the pilot's seat and around critical components, 155 pounds of armor that would save thousands of American lives. They used self-sealing fuel tanks that would automatically seal bullet holes, preventing fires that killed so many Japanese pilots. They installed 650 caliber machine guns, each gun firing 800 rounds per minute, able to destroy aircraft with short bursts. The combined firepower was devastating, 2,400 rounds per minute, concentrated in the wings, each bullet weighing half an ounce and traveling at 2,800 feet per second. A 2-second burst put 80 heavy bullets into the target, enough to saw wings off enemy aircraft or blow them apart in mid-air. The engine was enormous, a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial, producing 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the 1,130 horsepower of the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine. The engine gave the Hellcat a top speed of 380 mph, 40 mph faster than the Zero. More importantly, it provided superior performance at high altitude and in high-speed maneuvers. The first XF6F1 prototype flew June 26, 1942. Initial testing revealed an aircraft that was fast, tough, and lethal, but not particularly maneuverable. It couldn't turn with a Zero. The lighter Japanese fighter would complete turns faster. But it didn't need to turn with the Zero. The Hellcat's advantages lay elsewhere. It could outdive the Zero, outclimb it above 15,000 feet, outrun it in level flight, and outgun it catastrophically. The American fighter could choose when to engage and when to break off, advantages that Japanese fighters couldn't counter. Most importantly, the Hellcat could absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero and keep flying. American test pilots who flew both the Hellcat and captured Zeros understood the implications immediately. The Zero was more maneuverable in pure aerobatic terms, but the Hellcat was more effective in actual combat. The Japanese had optimized for aerobatic performance. The Americans had optimized for killing enemy aircraft and bringing their pilots home alive. The training revolution. While Grumman built better aircraft, the US Navy revolutionized pilot training to produce aviators who could exploit the Hellcat's advantages. The transformation was driven by recognition that Japanese pilot quality stemmed from extensive training, not inherent superiority, not Bushido spirit, but hundreds of hours of flight instruction that built skills American pilots could match or exceed. The Navy expanded pilot training programs massively, using America's industrial capacity and vast geography to build training infrastructure Japan couldn't match. By 1943, dozens of training airfields operated across the United States, producing thousands of pilots annually. Training hours per pilot increased from 305 hours in early 1942 to over 500 hours by late 1943, approaching Japanese pre-war standards. But the American training philosophy differed fundamentally from Japanese methods. Japanese training emphasized individual excellence. Pilots were expected to master their aircraft through grueling repetition, learning to execute maneuvers perfectly through muscle memory developed over years. Weak pilots were eliminated or killed during training. Survivors were exceptional but irreplaceable. American training emphasized systematic skill development and standardized tactics. Pilots learned not just how to fly, but how to fight as teams, section tactics, division tactics, coordinated attacks that multiplied effectiveness. They learned energy management, how to trade altitude for speed, how to maintain energy in combat, how to avoid situations where superior enemy maneuverability would be decisive. The training included combat films, gun camera footage from actual engagements showing what worked and what didn't. American pilots studied Japanese tactics, learned zero performance characteristics, practiced counter-tactics specifically designed to defeat the Japanese fighter. By the time pilots reached combat squadrons, they understood their enemy's strengths, weaknesses, and typical tactics. Most importantly, American training was sustainable. Japan's pre-war pilot training pipeline produced roughly 100 highly trained naval aviators per year, an elite force but impossible to expand rapidly. When experienced pilots died, and they died in increasing numbers through 1942–1943, Japan couldn't replace them quickly with equally skilled aviators. America's training system produced over 20,000 naval aviators in 1943 alone, 200 times Japan's pre-war rate. The pilots weren't individually as skilled as pre-war Japanese aces, but they were numerous, adequately trained, and improved rapidly through combat experience that survivors lived to apply. Lieutenant Alex Vratsiu, who would become the Navy's fourth-ranking ace with 19 victories, described the training advantage. "We weren't naturally better pilots than the Japanese. They had more experience, had been flying and fighting longer. But we had systematic training that taught us how to use our aircraft's advantages. We learned energy tactics. Don't try to turn with a zero. Use speed and altitude to control the engagement. We learned mutual support. Always fly in pairs, cover your wingman, never get isolated. We learned to recognize Japanese tactics and counter them. By the time I reached my squadron, I'd flown over 600 hours and received tactical training specifically designed to defeat Japanese fighters. I knew my aircraft's capabilities, knew the enemy's capabilities, knew what to do in every situation. That knowledge was worth more than any amount of aerobatic skill." The tide turns, 1943, August 1943. Marcus Island. The Pacific sky was clear when the new American fighter made its combat debut, the Grumman F6F Hellcat. The engagement was brief. Hellcats shot down several Japanese aircraft without losing a single plane. It was a small skirmish, but it revealed something extraordinary. The balance of air power in the Pacific was shifting. Over the following months, that shift became undeniable. The Hellcat, rugged, fast, and heavily armed, proved to be the perfect answer to Japan's once-dominant Zero. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American pilots were not just surviving. They were winning, and they were winning decisively. November 1943, Operation Galvanic. The U.S. Navy launched massive carrier strikes during the invasions of Tarawa and Makin. Hellcats flew cover for bombers, intercepted enemy aircraft, and swept Japanese airfields clean. By the end of the operation, the Hellcat achieved an astonishing 9-to-1 kill ratio against the defenders. American carriers attacked Japanese air bases with relentless precision, destroying planes on the ground, in the air, and even as they tried to take off. The once feared Japanese pilots, who had dominated the skies of 1942, now found themselves powerless. They were facing an aircraft they simply could not defeat. The Zero's advantages had evaporated. Superior maneuverability meant little when Hellcats refused to engage in turning dogfights. Instead, they used speed and altitude, diving through enemy formations in hit-and-run attacks that the lighter Zeros couldn't counter. Japanese pilots tried to draw them into tight turns, into duels of agility and reflexes. But the Americans wouldn't play their game. Hellcat pilots would dive from above, fire short bursts, and climb back into the clouds before the Zeros could react. The Japanese fighters' lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, once acceptable when they held the initiative, had become deadly flaws. A few well-placed rounds into a Zero's fuel tank would ignite it instantly. The aircraft would explode into flame, spiraling downward like a torch in the night. American pilots began calling Zeros Zippos after the cigarette lighter. They lit up with the first spark. Japanese aviators soon realized the grim truth: they could no longer kill Hellcats as easily. Even direct cannon hits often failed to bring the American fighters down. The Hellcat could absorb punishment that would have torn a Zero to pieces. 20mm shells punched through its metal skin without critical damage. Bullets struck armor plate and stopped. Fuel leaks sealed themselves before they could ignite. American pilots returned to their carriers, battered but alive, ready to fly again. Each time they came back, their confidence grew. Each time they fought, Japanese morale slipped further. The psychological toll on Japan's once proud aviators was immense. Pilots who once believed themselves invincible now faced the reality of technological and tactical inferiority. They were outnumbered, outtrained, and outfought. Their cherished code of Bushido, where death was preferable to failure, offered no comfort when death came so easily and so often. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, a veteran fighter ace with 12 victories, described the transformation in his diary. In 1942, we were confident, he wrote. Our training was superior, our aircraft was superior, our spirit was superior. American pilots fled from combat or died when they stood to fight. By 1943, everything had changed. The Americans fly new fighters that are faster and more heavily armed than the Zero. Their pilots are well-trained and numerous. They refuse to fight on our terms. They exploit every advantage. We cannot outrun them because they are faster. We cannot escape by diving because they dive better. We cannot absorb damage because our aircraft have no armor. If we make one mistake, we die. They can make many mistakes and live. The kill ratio has reversed. In 1942, we killed 5 Americans for every Japanese loss. Now, they kill 5 of us for every American lost. Our experienced pilots are dying faster than they can be replaced. Soon, only the inexperienced will remain. And then, the slaughter will accelerate. Nakajima's prediction proved true. In February 1944, his Zero was shot down by Hellcats over Truck Lagoon. The raid destroyed more than 200 Japanese aircraft in just 2 days. By then, Japanese air power in the Central Pacific had been effectively annihilated. The tide had turned, and it would never turn back. June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By June 1944, Japanese naval aviation had declined catastrophically from its 1942 peak. The mobile fleet that departed Japanese waters for Operation Ago, the defense of the Mariana Islands, carried 430 aircraft manned by pilots averaging 275 flight hours, compared to 800-plus hours for pre-war aviators. Many pilots had fewer than 100 hours in type, barely qualified to land on carriers, let alone fight experienced American pilots. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the mobile fleet, understood his pilots were inadequate, but believed Japanese tactical advantages would compensate. His carriers could launch strikes from 300 miles beyond the range of American aircraft, allowing Japanese planes to attack while American fighters remained tied to fleet defense. Japanese aircraft could land at bases in the Marianas, refuel, and strike American carriers again on the return flight. A tactic called the shuttle bombing that would multiply Japanese effectiveness. The plan was elegant, but relied on assumptions that were 2 years obsolete: that Japanese aircraft were superior, that Japanese pilots could execute complex operations, that American defenses were unsophisticated. All 3 assumptions were wrong. American Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, deployed 15 carriers with 891 aircraft, including 475 F6F Hellcats. American pilots averaged over 500 flight hours, many with combat experience. The American carriers had advanced radar that could detect incoming raids at 150 miles, providing ample time to position fighters for interception. On June 19, 1944, Ozawa launched his first strike at 0830 hours. 69 aircraft, heading toward the American fleet 200 miles east. American radar detected the formation at 150 miles. Mitcher's fighter director officer vectored Hellcats to intercept, positioning them between the Japanese formation and the carriers, at altitude advantage, with superior numbers. The massacre began at 10:36 hours when the first American fighters engaged Japanese strike aircraft 60 miles from the fleet. What followed was systematic slaughter. Lieutenant Alex Vratsiu, flying with VF-16 from the carrier Lexington, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes, a feat that would earn him fame as one of the war's top aces. His combat report captured the one-sided nature of the engagement. We intercepted the enemy formation at 20,000 feet, altitude advantage in our favor. The Japanese aircraft, Judys and Jills with 0 escorts, maintained tight formation, apparently unaware we were above them. I dove on a Judy dive bomber, fired a 2-second burst from dead astern. The aircraft exploded, fuel tank fire. I pulled up, selected another target, fired again. Another explosion. I repeated this 4 more times in rapid succession: dive, shoot, kill, zoom back to altitude. The Japanese pilots seemed stunned. They didn't take evasive action, didn't break formation, just flew straight while we shot them down. Their 0 escorts tried to intervene, but they were outnumbered and outperformed. We killed them as easily as the bombers. The entire engagement lasted 8 minutes. I expended 360 rounds of ammunition and destroyed 6 aircraft confirmed, 1 probable. I took no hits, experienced no mechanical problems, returned to the carrier with adequate fuel. It wasn't combat, it was execution. The slaughter repeated across the entire intercept area. Of 69 aircraft in the first Japanese strike, 42 were shot down before reaching the American fleet. The survivors faced intense anti-aircraft fire from the carrier screen, over 600 ships equipped with radar-directed 5-inch guns and proximity-fused shells that detonated near aircraft without requiring direct hits. Of the 69 aircraft launched, only 27 returned to their carriers. The few aircraft that managed to attack the American fleet achieved 1 bomb hit on the battleship South Dakota, minor damage that didn't affect combat capability. Ozawa, receiving reports that his first strike had devastated the American fleet. False reports from pilots who'd either confused anti-aircraft bursts with bomb hits or deliberately lied to avoid admitting failure. Launched 3 more strikes throughout the day. Each strike met the same fate: detected by radar at long range, intercepted by overwhelming numbers of Hellcats, massacred before reaching the American carriers. By day's end, Japanese mobile fleet had launched 373 aircraft in 4 strikes. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed approximately 300, an 80% loss rate unprecedented in carrier warfare. American losses: 29 aircraft shot down, most to anti-aircraft fire rather than Japanese fighters. The kill ratio for the day: roughly 10.1 in favor of American forces. For fighter versus fighter combat, the ratio approached 20.1. For every Hellcat lost in air combat, 20 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. American pilots called the engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, referencing the American tradition of turkey shooting contests, where marksmen shot at live turkeys for sport. The name was apt. The combat had been one-sided slaughter rather than battle between equals. Commander Tamechi Hara, watching from the destroyer Yahagi, described the returning aircraft. Our strike force departed in the morning, over 300 aircraft, the pride of the mobile fleet. I watched them climb to altitude and disappear toward the east. Through the afternoon, we waited for reports of victory. Instead, we received increasingly desperate radio transmissions. Strike forces under attack, aircraft shot down, unable to penetrate American defenses. As evening approached, survivors began returning, not in formations, individually, in pairs, damaged aircraft struggling to reach the carriers. I counted perhaps 100 aircraft that returned of the 300 that departed. The pilots who landed told stories of slaughter. American fighters had been everywhere, outnumbering our aircraft, shooting down bombers and fighters with impunity. Our pilots, young, inexperienced, barely trained, had been massacred by skilled Americans flying superior aircraft. I knew in that moment that we had lost the war. Our fleet still sailed, our ships were undamaged, but without aircraft and pilots, carriers are merely targets. We had gambled everything on this operation and lost everything. Japanese naval aviation was finished. The aftermath. The Battle of the Philippine Sea effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as a meaningful force. Ozawa's mobile fleet had been stripped of its air wings, 3 carriers lost to American submarine attacks, and the remaining carriers left with fewer than 100 operational aircraft, manned by pilots too inexperienced to operate effectively. The Japanese carriers that survived would never conduct significant operations again. In the Battle of Leyte Gulf 4 months later, Japanese carriers served as decoys, deliberately drawing American attention while battleships attempted to attack invasion shipping. The carriers had no aircraft, no pilots, no capability beyond serving as bait. The statistics from June 19, 1944, documented the complete reversal from 1942. Japanese aircraft lost, approximately 300 in combat, another 50 to operational accidents. American aircraft lost, 29 in combat, 80 to operational accidents during night recovery operations on June 20th. Kill ratio 10.3 to 1 in favor of American forces. For the F6F Hellcat specifically, the Philippine Sea engagement represented a vindication of American design philosophy. The toy plane that Japanese commanders had mocked in 1942 had achieved a kill ratio exceeding 19.1 for the entire day, destroying Japanese aircraft at rates that made continued Japanese carrier operations impossible. The Hellcat's overall combat record would eventually reach 5,123 aerial victories against 270 losses in air combat, a 19.3.1 kill ratio, the highest of any American fighter in World War II. Hellcat pilots would shoot down more enemy aircraft than any other Allied fighter type, accounting for approximately 56% of all U.S. Navy air-to-air victories. The Japanese perspective. Comprehension. Japanese commanders' understanding of their defeat evolved slowly, shaped by institutional inability to accept that American technology and training had surpassed Japanese capabilities. Even after the Marianas Turkey shoot, many Japanese officers blamed the defeat on pilot inexperience, rather than fundamental technological and tactical disadvantages. Captain Toshikazu Omai, senior staff officer for the mobile fleet, wrote in his post-battle assessment, "Our defeat at the Philippine Sea stemmed from inadequate pilot training and numerical disadvantage, not from American technological superiority. The Zero fighter remains superior in maneuverability to American aircraft. Our experienced pilots flying properly maintained Zeros can defeat American fighters. The problem is that we lack experienced pilots and adequate numbers. American industrial capacity produces aircraft faster than we can destroy them. American training programs produce pilots faster than we can kill them. We are facing quantitative superiority that we cannot match. If we had 1942's pilot quality and adequate numbers, we would prevail regardless of American aircraft types. The solution is to accelerate pilot training and increase aircraft production. The assessment missed the fundamental point. American aircraft had become qualitatively superior. American pilots were as well trained as Japanese aviators, and American tactics specifically countered Japanese advantages. Japan couldn't win by producing more of an obsolete fighter type and training pilots to 1942 standards. Some Japanese officers understood the truth. Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactician who designed the Pearl Harbor attack, recognized by late 1944 that Japanese aviation had been comprehensively defeated. His assessment, written in October 1944, but not submitted officially because it contradicted required optimism. We have lost the air war. American fighters are superior to the Zero in all aspects that matter in actual combat: speed, firepower, survivability, high-altitude performance. American pilots are numerous, well-trained and aggressive. They use tactics that exploit their advantages and negate ours. They attack from positions of advantage and disengage when conditions favor us. They coordinate attacks, support each other, and fight as teams rather than individuals. Our pilots die in their first or second combat missions. The few experienced pilots who remain cannot compensate for overwhelming American advantages in numbers, technology, and training quality. We cling to the myth that Japanese spirit compensates for material inferiority. It does not. Spirit cannot dodge bullets, cannot make slow aircraft fast, cannot make weak aircraft strong. We are sending young men to die in obsolete aircraft because we cannot admit we have been defeated technologically. Genda's assessment was accurate but politically impossible to submit. Japanese military culture demanded optimism, punished defeatism, and rejected technological determinism. Admitting defeat was dishonorable, therefore defeat could not be admitted even when obvious. The final accounting. By war's end in August 1945, the F6F Hellcat had compiled a combat record unmatched by any other fighter aircraft. 5,223 aerial victories in combat against 270 air-to-air losses, 19.3.1 kill ratio. Including operational losses, the ratio was 5.9.1, still the highest of any American fighter. The Hellcat had destroyed Japanese naval aviation as an effective force. The battles of 1944, the Philippine Sea, the Marianas, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, saw Hellcats systematically destroy Japanese aircraft faster than Japan could build or train replacements. By 1945, Japanese air bases stood largely empty, not from lack of aircraft, but from lack of pilots capable of flying them. The human cost was staggering. Of approximately 15,000 Japanese naval aviators who served during the war, roughly 10,500 died, a 70% casualty rate concentrated heavily in 1944-1945, when pilot quality had collapsed and American technological advantage had become overwhelming. American naval aviation casualties were significantly lighter. Approximately 6,800 naval aviators killed in combat out of over 60,000 who served, an 11% casualty rate. The Hellcat's armor and rugged construction saved thousands of American lives. Pilots survived damage that would have killed them in earlier aircraft and returned to combat. The industrial statistics told the story of incompatible production scales. Grumman produced 12,275 F6F Hellcats between 1942 and 1945, approximately 10 aircraft per day at peak production. Mitsubishi produced approximately 10,400 Zeros during the entire war, impressive by Japanese standards but inadequate against American mass production. American production was distributed across multiple types. In addition to Hellcats, the Navy operated F-4U Corsairs, FM-2 Wildcats, and other fighters simultaneously. Total American fighter production exceeded 60,000 aircraft during the war, versus approximately 30,000 for Japan across all types. The training disparity was even more extreme. By 1944, the United States was training over 100,000 pilots annually across all services, more pilots than Japan trained during the entire war. American training infrastructure, thousands of aircraft, hundreds of bases, systematic curricula, was producing pilots at scales Japan couldn't imagine. The legacy. The F6F Hellcat represented a fundamental shift in fighter design philosophy, away from pure aerobatic performance toward combat effectiveness measured in kills per loss ratio and pilot survival rates. The aircraft sacrificed ultimate maneuverability for advantages that mattered more in actual combat: speed, firepower, survivability, and ease of production. Post-war fighter design followed the Hellcat's example rather than the Zeros. Modern fighters emphasize survivability, firepower, speed, and systems integration over pure aerobatic performance. The F-15 Eagle's design philosophy, not a pound for air-to-ground, echoed the Hellcat's single-minded focus on air superiority through superior performance in the attributes that matter. The Hellcat also validated tactical innovation over traditional doctrine. Japanese pilots trained to fight using maneuvers developed in the 1930s, aerobatic techniques that emphasized individual skill. American pilots developed new tactics that exploited technological advantages: energy management, mutual support, coordinated attacks. The tactical revolution proved more important than aerobatic skill. A mediocre pilot flying a Hellcat using proper tactics could defeat an expert pilot in a Zero using traditional dogfighting techniques. The Americans had changed the rules of air combat, and the Japanese continued playing by old rules until they ran out of pilots. Epilogue. The toy that won the war. Japanese commanders had laughed at America's toy planes in 1942. Heavy, crude, lacking the elegant performance of the Zero. The Hellcat seemed to embody everything wrong with American design. Overweight, overpowered, over-engineered, built by engineers who didn't understand fighter combat. They stopped laughing by 1944. The toy plane had proven devastatingly effective, killing Japanese aircraft at ratios that made continued Japanese carrier operations impossible. The heavy armor saved American pilots. The powerful engine provided speed Japanese fighters couldn't match. The heavy armament destroyed Japanese aircraft with short bursts. Commander Hara survived the war, one of the few Japanese destroyer captains to do so. In post-war interviews, he described the moment he understood Japan had lost. "I watched our aircraft depart on June 19, 1944, over 300 planes, the finest we could assemble. I watched perhaps 100 return. The pilots who survived told stories of American fighters everywhere, shooting down our aircraft like they were clay pigeons. I realized then that we had underestimated American capability fundamentally. We had believed American pilots were inferior. They were equal or superior. We had believed American aircraft were inadequate. They were superior. We had believed American tactics were primitive. They were sophisticated. We had laughed at their toy planes in 1942 when we were winning. By 1944, the toys were killing us, and we had no answer. The Hellcat didn't just defeat the Zero. It destroyed Japanese naval aviation completely. We lost the war in many places, for many reasons. But we lost control of the sky to American fighters flown by American pilots who proved better than us at everything that mattered. The toys weren't toys. They were the best fighters in the Pacific, and by the time we understood that, it was too late to matter. The F6F Hellcat flew its last combat mission in August 1945. The aircraft that Japanese commanders had mocked as a toy had destroyed Japanese naval aviation, enabled American advances across the Pacific, and helped win the war. The final tally: over 5,200 enemy aircraft destroyed, 306 American aces created, countless American pilots brought home alive because the aircraft they flew was tough enough to absorb punishment and keep flying. They laughed at America's toy planes in 1942. By 1944, the laughter had died, replaced by the sound of Hellcats diving through Japanese formations, their .50 caliber guns tearing Zeros apart, their pilots executing tactics the Japanese couldn't counter, proving that American engineering, American training, and American industrial might had combined to create a fighter that ruled Pacific skies. The Hellcat arrived, and Japanese naval aviation died. The toy had become a tiger, and by the time Japanese commanders understood what they faced, their carriers sailed without aircraft, their air bases stood empty of pilots, and the war was lost.